All right, welcome again. My name is Ben Marlin. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and associate director for Mass AITC. I'll be moderating the first session this morning. So our intent for the first session this morning is really to dig into challenges and opportunities for machine learning, AI, and related methodologies in the aging and dementia space. Our two speakers for this session are Conor Walsh from Harvard and Marisa Gizemi from MIT. So Conor is Paul A. Maeder Professor of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and an associate faculty member at the Weiss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. He's the founder of the Harvard Biodesign Lab, a multidisciplinary group focused on disruptive robotics technologies for augmenting and restoring human performance. Conor is the recipient of multiple awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, an IEEE Early Academic Career Award in Robotics and Automation, the NSF Career Award, and an MIT Technology Review Top 35 under 35 Award. So, Conor, please.
Morning, everybody. Thanks, Ben, for organizing this interesting panel, and thanks to the leadership for the invitation to kind of come and be part of this today. It's my first time at this meeting. So I think my slides should be able to kind of switch if we switch to the laptop. Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to give an overview today of a bunch of work that we're doing on our group, really focused on assisting and assessing human movement. And we do that through a combination of soft-wearable robots, and also kind of through sparse sensing and using machine learning and AI as well. So, you can see a few pictures here of the types of projects that we've worked on before, and I'll kind of give an overview of a bunch of different things that we've been working on. So some of you might be familiar with rigid exoskeletons. So these are kind of like exciting technologies that like over the last 10 to 15 years have really kind of enabled people who are fully paralyzed be able to walk. And so when we started our research group, we felt like there was already a pretty good trajectory kind of like on that technology. And that technology is like really most suited to people who are really non-ambulatory. So people who really can't walk at all. So it could be someone with a spinal cord injury or other kind of like indications. And so what we thought is that there's a whole host of people who can walk, just not very well. How do we develop technologies that improve mobility for that population? So these kind of poorly ambulatory type of people. And so we developed what we call the soft exosuit. So this is kind of like a soft-wearable robot that largely uses apparel and textiles to interface to the human body. So you want to attach without kind of rigid components or heavy components that add restrictions or mass to the person. And then we basically use cables, so motors pulling on cables, to act as artificial muscles, like you can see in this figure, that apply assistance in parallel with the underlying biological muscles to help either reduce the amount of work they have to do or to restore function if those muscles aren't working correctly. And so we did a lot of work with DARPA early on and looking at kind of healthy applications for walking and running and helping people kind of like walk longer or further with less effort. But then we really turned our attention to thinking about what's the big clinical applications of this technology as well. I'm just going to start my talk giving an overview of some of the technologies, and then I'll bring in some of the AI and ML stuff throughout. And so we created a version of this that assists with hip flexion. So basically kind of as a person is walking, you can kind of see this animation here. As a person's foot is about to come off the ground, we apply a gentle tug on the leg to kind of help the user advance the limb, so that, if they're not able to do that well themselves. And kind of somewhat serendipitously, in collaboration with Terry Ellis, who's at Sargent College at Boston University, and we started to kind of focus on a population that she had a lot of knowledge on, people with Parkinson's disease, and really kind of thinking about, would we be able to help alleviate freezing of gait for this population? So some of you may know, but this is like a really big problem for a large subset of people with Parkinson's disease, where their ability to regulate their own walking is really impaired and limited. And this leads to them to essentially getting stuck and having this shuffling pattern that leaves them freezing in place. And the consequence of this is like they don't really walk very far, they don't really engage in their community, and they fall quite a lot as well. So the next video will just show side by side, where on the left side, the person's wearing our technology, but it's turned off, so it's not doing anything. And then on the right side, this person is kind of like wearing the technology, and it's basically applying these kind of gentle mechanical cues every time the person is taking a step. And so for us, this was a really exciting finding that, for this individual, basically can't walk around, his community at all. And using this type of technology now, he'd be able to kind of like walk, not normally, but in a much more normal way than he would not be able to otherwise. And so we believe what's happening here is kind of the device is really allowing a person to better regulate their stride length, and kind of like normally when a freeze happens, a person's stride length gradually reduces, their cadence goes up, and then they kind of freeze. So we're kind of preventing that kind of downward cycle from kind of happening and allowing a person to kind of be able to maintain their mobility. And so we recently got a grant from the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and now we're kind of extending this to kind of like a 20-person study, both in the home and in the community, and really trying to understand what's the impact of this technology on this population. And, in terms of this kind of initial case study that we did, and you can kind of see here that we did eliminate freezing for this individual. I would say we don't always eliminate freezing. Most of the time it reduces, but it doesn't always get completely eliminated. So we're trying to understand how to make it work better. But you can see here in terms of function, people can walk further, than they would without being able to use the device. So this is kind of like the real world impact. But I think this paper really focused on straight line walking, so people walking in a straight line. But really kind of for people with Parkinson's, it's these kind of environmental triggers such as tight spaces, crowds, turning, kind of that like induced freezing of gait. So we've been kind of thinking about how do we simulate some of those in the lab, and we're learning from this by visiting people in the home. And so this is just kind of showing kind of like our motion capture lab and one of our volunteers. And so the suit is turned off here. You don't hear it working, and you see them kind of walking in an okay way, but once they get to this kind of like obstacle, which simulates kind of their kitchen in their home, and they have a hard time kind of like navigating that because it kind of triggers this kind of like freeze type kind of like event, which you can kind of see here.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so just touching down on the chair, just saying out loud. Yeah.
And so then for the next part of the video, you'll hear the device on. We try and make it quiet because we don't want it to sound like, a machine, but you can kind of hear the motors actuating.
Wow.
Oh my God.
So this was pretty exciting for our team, seeing that like during these kind of like more challenging gait conditions, the suit can still have this function and kind of help prevent kind of freezing of gait. And so I think we're just starting to think about like where do we use AI and machine learning, and probably machine learning in particular, to understand the context of like what is a person doing, how do we understand that, what should the suit do differently kind of in those different contexts, and how to personalize it and optimize it kind of like for each person, because each person has a different gait, different potentially phenotype of freezing. And so I think there's a kind of a rich kind of path forward kind of like on this project. Another area, so that's kind of more assistance, like let's help people move when they're wearing this technology. Another thing that we're very excited about is like how do we use softwareable robots to enable rehabilitation at home? So rehabilitation is really hard for neurological populations. They really don't get better, and if they do, it's usually only a small amount. And a big reason is that they're just not getting the dose of rehabilitation that's required in order to really make gains. And the reason they don't get the dose is because they have to go into a clinic to see a therapist. And if they try and do it at home, it's hard. They don't have the tools, the motivation, the support to kind of be able to do that. So it's kind of like they get like an order of magnitude less than they need. So how do we kind of think about kind of devices and tools that extend the ability of a therapist to enable kind of like working closely and intimately with a patient in the home environment, so they can kind of do rehabilitation every day, potentially multiple times a day, and get an order of magnitude dose. So our first project in this area was a soft robotic glove. It was licensed by a startup from our lab, Imago Rehab. And so here the idea is that a person would be able to go through kind of like both stretching, some functional activities and some assessment activities. And then there's sensors embedded in these devices that can kind of quantify changes or improvements over time. And this can then be shared with a therapist. I think virtual therapy is now much greater than it was 5 or 6 years ago, for a variety of reasons. But I think that ability of like data-driven rehab at home with kind of softwareable robots, I think has a lot of potential. And so we ran a study before the technology spun out, just building multiple of these prototypes, deploying them in people's homes. And I would just say for an academic group, this is quite hard. I think building prototypes that users can use without the grad student being there, tweaking parameters on a laptop, is kind of challenging. But it's something that we're really trying to do more of. And we think that there's this gap between academia and industry at the moment where, university researchers can't take things far enough most of the time to be able to do these types of home studies. And then industry, is really looking to kind of lock down a design super quickly because their investors or funders kind of like want to move ahead and get a product. And a big reason why a lot of these technologies fail is there's not enough iterative development with patients and with clinicians early on to try things, learn from that, and kind of go through that a few times. So that's an effort that we have at Harvard at the moment, is trying to think about like, how do we build an initiative that will kind of help us to do that. And so with this technology, we monitored how people use the device. So the kind of maybe key things to highlight is just the plot B, where if we think about comparing to standard of care, I think it was cutting in and out. Sorry, I don't know if you're seeing it cut in and out. It's good. Okay, it's just cutting out here. So compared to standard of care, people are getting more dose. So we are seeing that people are able to use this a lot of times. They're motivated to use it. And that in theory will lead to better outcomes if people do that over a longer period of time. This was over 4 weeks. And then you'll see in C, red is basically the amount of occupational therapist check-ins that we had over the 4 weeks. And we kind of deliberately gradually reduced that because we were trying to see like, will people still use this device if we're not checking in? And we did. We saw kind of like a constant kind of like use over time using this technology as well, which was exciting to see. So in the lab at the moment, we're thinking beyond the hand and how do we kind of also assist kind of the upper extremity. And so I'll talk a little bit on this project, how we're using kind of like machine learning to try and personalize control for these types of devices. And so here you can see kind of what we want to assist with is activities of daily living and allow a person either to be more functional at home or to practice activities at home. That would in theory help them get better if they did that. So here's kind of like another prototype device that we've built. And this is also inflatable, just like the glove. So we have a balloon that goes underneath the arm. That balloon can kind of have the air pressure inside it controlled. And then we can kind of provide a certain degree of gravity all floating against the limb and kind of like help a person be able to kind of like raise their limb. And then so we have a paper in review at the moment looking at how do we develop a control strategy that is simple because we want people to be able to use this independently at home and that allows them to be able to kind of intuitively kind of like use this device and without a lot of training. And so the general idea is we have two different types of sensors. So we have motion sensors in the sleeve that monitor like how is a person's arm moving. This won't work for someone who has no arm capacity. You have to have some residual capacity and we're basically amplifying that. And then the second thing that we're measuring is using these kind of yellow sensors that you can see here. So IMUs are the motion sensors, the kind of compression sensors that are measuring the interaction forces or pressures between the user and the device as well. So basically how much is it pushing against the person or how much is the person pushing against it. So we basically kind of have those sensors integrated and then we have a calibration routine where we ask a person to kind of move their arm and then we kind of have the device kind of automatically kind of like move the person's arm. And then we basically kind of collect some data and we train a model that will predict 3 states. And the 3 states are, is a person trying to move up? Is a person trying to hold? Or is a person trying to lower down? And so we're basically kind of training a machine learning model that we can then embed in the controller and run in real time as part of that kind of control loop and to be able to kind of detect the intent of the person as well. And then there's a few other things that are important, but that's kind of like the key idea for today. So this video here just kind of shows an idea of the 3 states. So red is going down, blue is hold, green is lifting up. And then you can kind of see here, kind of this is the arm movement. So this top part of the graph is going to be the arm movement. So you'll just see this kind of like dot move along this trajectory. And that's as the person is moving their arm. So arm elevation angle. And then down here, we're just seeing a bunch of signals. So the arm elevation, the commanded pressure. So I couldn't remember exactly what it was. The commanded pressure. So how much air is in, what's the pressure of the air inside the actuator as well. And then you're also just seeing this kind of top graph here is the elevation angle of the arm measured with the IMU as well. So I'll just let this play. It plays a few times. It's not that exciting, but you'll basically see how a person is moving and the controller is automatically detecting those different states and the intent of the person and then switching between those to enable a person to be able to kind of use this device without having to kind of like think any differently. It's basically just like working with them and essentially like power steering for them. So it responds to their intent and responds to their movement. And I'll just let the last one play as well. So as you see the person start to lift their arm, it initially sees, okay, you're going up, then you're holding for a while, and then you're kind of coming down as well. So I think there's just a lot of potential to embed these types of methods inside controllers for wearable robots. We can debate, how you best do that. What are the challenges with that maybe on the panel? I think that'd be an interesting topic to discuss. And then here's just the reason for having multiple different sensors. So you can see here, this blue signal at the top where it turns to red, that's the motion sensor. So, if you were just trying to look at that signal alone, you really don't get a great signal in terms of what a person is trying to do going from blue, which is hold, to red, which is lower. But if you have the kind of compression sensor in there and you see that interaction force between the person and the device, now you can start to see that, okay, the person's, the pressure is increasing, the person is trying to lower. And so that's where the advantage of kind of using multiple different types of sensors kind of comes in. You can look at motion and interaction forces, and both of them are probably important for these types of applications. And so this is just another last video on this, just kind of showing, here's a person trying to perform a task kind of like without the device turned on, so it's not doing anything, and they have a hard time. And then the next thing is you'll see their motion is very smooth. They're basically just kind of like moving naturally. And then that balloon is kind of gradually inflating in a controlled way and to provide enough support so that person can leverage that residual capacity to be able to perform that task that they wouldn't normally be able to do. So I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about some work on the lower extremity that we're doing. So this is also in collaboration with Terry Ellis and also Lou Awad at Boston University and Sargent College. And here we're really focused on trying to restore mobility for people who have suffered a stroke. And so here you can see it's well known, but kind of obvious consequences. Basically, people walk slower, they don't walk as much, and they're quite inefficient. Falls are also a challenge for this population. And then the standard of care is really using kind of like AFOs or orthotics for people. So what we're trying to develop are wearable robots that would actively support plantar flexion or dorsiflexion for this population. And ideally, they would be able to use these devices in the home and in the community as well. So we have a big body of work kind of where we've studied these devices in the lab. And Lou has done a lot of trials kind of seeing how do people recover when they use these devices in a simulated rehab setting from a clinical trial perspective. But the vision here really is that we want to kind of go away from like the fixed static support that an AFO provides and have dynamic support from a robotic AFO, if you want to think about it like that kind of actively applies active dorsiflexion and plantar flexion that can be personalized for different people. And we've shown that that's important in terms of kind of how well people respond to these technologies. And also can be changed over time. So like if a person is progressing, you can provide less support. If a person is, going the other direction, you can provide more support as well. But one of the things that's, you can imagine here, we don't have like a real nice setup for evaluating these technologies. So I think this is where machine learning and AI kind of like has potential. Like how do we think about having quantitative, rich assessments of changes in performance, in this case here, walking biomechanics, kind of like outside of a lab environment. I think that's kind of where we see a big opportunity. And specifically for people post-stroke, kind of one of the big challenges is, or one of the big areas of focus from an interventional point of view is focusing on increasing propulsion. So a lot of people focus on ground clearance. That's what AFOs do well. They keep person's toes up, but they restrict plantar flexion, which is what's required for propulsion in order to move yourself forward. And so it's been shown that if you think about it from a functional point of view, deficits in propulsion are very much related to deficits in walking speed. And really what we want to get to is kind of better walking speed, better walking distance for people in the home and the community. And so this is kind of showing that maybe targeting propulsion is really what's needed in order to enable that to happen. But how do we measure propulsion? How do we measure changes in propulsion kind of out in the real world? I think that's kind of like, a challenge kind of currently. So we ran a study with a pilot with the device that I showed in the video, where we actually kind of had people train for 4 weeks. So we gave them these devices. There was a lot of technical support required from our team, but they used them mostly independently at home over those 4 weeks. And, we saw kind of that there were, for 2 people, big changes in propulsion. So they did actually kind of, benefit from this training protocol with the device. And then for the 2 other people, there wasn't much of a change, which is actually pretty common in studies with people post-stroke. You see this kind of like very varied response. And we're still trying to understand that with Lou. But it's exciting that some people did kind of like have these responses. And we also saw that there seemed to be a strong connection between people who benefited initially when they wore the device. So they kind of had a response initially when putting the device on, and to the long-term training effects that would come from kind of continued practice as well. We saw a strong correlation between those two. And so some work that we've been doing in the lab at the moment this is kind of ongoing. It's also in review at the moment, is trying to think about like how would we, because normally you measure propulsion with a rigid force plate in the ground in a lab that's basically kind of like a force sensor. So how do we kind of measure propulsion out in the community? So what we're doing is we're collecting large data sets of people post-stroke walking in the lab, where we have ground truth rich biomechanics data and ground truth kind of force data from the lab. And then we're putting on a number of IMUs, inertial measurement units, on the person. And also we're adding in insoles into their shoes to measure pressure, ground pressure. And then we're training a machine learning model that allows us to estimate the anterior, posterior ground reaction force, so that we can then deploy that kind of outside in the community and get a good estimate of propulsion as well. So when you think about these technologies, I think it's important to not just be thinking about building a robot that does something, but how do you measure changes in how a person is performing kind of with those technologies over time as well. And so that's a kind of a big focus kind of in the lab at the moment as well. And I would say, like, I'll just give a few comments and then we could talk about it more on the panel. training these models is hard. I'm making it sound maybe a little bit easy. You just kind of do this and then you get a nice model. But I think everybody walks differently, and the data set that you use really informs kind of how well these models work. Creating a generalized model that like works well for everyone is really hard, and extrapolating beyond the boundaries of the data set that you've collected. So if you have people walk kind of at a medium speed in your training data, but then some people are really slow or some people are really fast, it may not work as well for them as well. So I think kind of how you kind of get accurate models with a minimal amount of individual calibration, I think is still a big challenge kind of for the field. So then the kind of last area that I'll just talk about is, in addition to just biomechanical measurements, so these are kind of like propulsion is a measure that you can get in the lab, how do you kind of estimate clinical measures or clinical assessments, in a quick, easy, simple way in the home, and using, sparse sensing and machine learning as well. So for upper extremity stroke rehab, that's something that, is hard. But a big part of it is understanding how is a person progressing. And if they're not coming into a clinic and you're doing therapy at home, how do you estimate that at home? So the way that you assess performance for stroke survivors in a clinic at the moment is through something commonly the Fugl-Meyer assessment, which is basically kind of like a bunch of movements that a therapist will ask a person to perform. And then they basically grade those on a 0, 1, or 2 kind of scoring system, where 2 is great, 0 is can't do it at all, and 1 is somewhere in the middle. So it's very coarse, kind of like, first of all. But it also takes time, and you require kind of like an in-person interaction as well. So we have a paper that's about to come out kind of looking at, well, could you kind of like, enable estimation of, and it basically takes about 20 to 30 minutes to do this, but could you enable estimation of Fugl-Meyer scores by just having a person spend 1 minute kind of trying to reach with their paretic arm? And that's basically kind of like the challenge that we had. So this would be a person sitting down at their desk, maybe they're doing it over Zoom with a therapist, and they're just basically moving their arm in a certain way. And then from that simple motion, can we estimate the Fugl-Meyer score? So we've been kind of working on a project where we're basically kind of bringing in stroke survivors. We have a therapist do a Fugl-Meyer assessment in the lab. So that's our kind of ground truth kind of data that we want to try and predict with our machine learning model. And then we basically kind of like collect motion capture data with IMUs and also kind of cameras of a person moving while performing that assessment. So we have kind of like very rich kind of information there. And then we also have a person kind of perform just simple movements. And then we also kind of record data kind of during that as well. And then what we want to do is train a model that allows us to predict kind of like the rich information captured during the Fugl-Meyer assessment with the simple data kind of collected from the simple reaching movements. So this is just an example of kind of like our data collection. So we have 4 different IMUs. If you think about one arm, so 1 on the torso and 3 on each arm, but really we're just focused on the paretic arm. And then this is kind of like the data collection that we would kind of like have. So we have a person, first of all, do the Fugl-Meyer assessment. That's FMA in the top. So we would do that with both arms just to kind of build up a bigger data set for this project. Then we have a person perform these reaching motions that you can kind of see here. And then basically we're able to kind of like predict the Fugl-Meyer score based on just the reaching moments for this person as well. And we also think this is somewhat practical because, most likely a stroke survivor is going to see a therapist in clinic at some point, and they're going to get an in-person Fugl-Meyer at some point. So you kind of have this unique opportunity to kind of get that individual ground truth data kind of like for that person. And so we kind of like the idea of kind of training a generalized model, but then getting some individual specific data that can kind of augment that generalized model. And so that's kind of definitely a direction we're thinking about for a bunch of projects. And then these are just some of the types of features. So kind of looking at raw data from the IMU sensors. But then one thing we also did for this project was think about what's a more stroke specific feature that we could kind of try and use in this machine learning model. And what we decided to focus on was kind of something that was representative of compensation strategies. So for these people, because they have impaired arm function, they often compensate a lot with their torso. So we looked at both ratio features and different features between sensors that are on the torso and the arm. And we found those to be kind of very helpful in kind of getting a more accurate model and for predicting this. So the results were pretty interesting. And, we saw kind of like relatively good with a small data set. I think it was like 10 people or something like that. And we saw kind of pretty good kind of comparison between kind of the ground truth Fugl-Meyer scores and the estimated scores from our model. So we think there's a lot of potential to enable these type of clinical assessments kind of like at home and, using very simple structured motions that you could ask a person to perform. So then the last 2 slides for my talk are very different, but I thought I'd include them. So in terms of kind of aging and that specific population, one area that we have thought about in the lab is like, how do we help people as they age, and how do we support people perform physical tasks? And so assisting the back is something that we kind of identified as kind of a big challenge for people. as people age. But also kind of a lot of times you have people aging together where there's kind of like a spouse kind of like looking after the other person, and that person also could use support from a device that would kind of help. So kind of the idea of kind of like a wearable back exosuit that could provide offloading of the spine or the tissues in the back, for either the individual who's aging or a caregiver who's looking after them. We think that there's a nice kind of like opportunity there. And so this is the last slide, another project that we've worked on, which is a very simple, easy to use back exosuit that takes about 40% of the strain off a person's back. And you can kind of see here this red ribbon is essentially this artificial muscle that's in parallel with the back and the spine. It doesn't really restrict how people move at all. And then every time you lift, it basically automatically applies force to unload the tissue. And we've shown that, it definitely in healthy people has a big impact on reducing risk factors for injury. And then we have an ongoing clinical trial with BU looking at how this device could be used for individuals with low back pain. So I think I'll wrap there and just acknowledge, like I've talked about a bunch of different projects, but I think you can see that our work is definitely very much focused on assisting and assessing human movement. I thought I'd just give a snapshot of the types of projects we're working on and then where we're looking at applying machine learning and AI for those projects, and definitely happy to talk more on the panel as well. But thanks again for the opportunity to come and speak.